Okay, we're right back at it here at 3 o'clock with Benchmark and Red Hat. From Benchmark, we have Shlomo Bielak, Chief Technology Officer. Shlomo's is the CTO and is building expertise to shift global markets and understanding how to make transformational initiatives scale without heroics. His experience and thought leadership, coupled with his talented engineering effectiveness department, are creating never-before-seen solutions for multi-cloud DevOps, DevSecOps, and enabling continuous deployment to production for the enterprise. A rich and responsive customer service experience is the outcome, so that should be interesting. And then Todd Wilson, Chief Strategist for Canada at Red Hat. Todd has worked with leading-edge technology and leveraging his skills as a change agent to deliver success through partnership and innovation for over 20 years. Prior to joining Red Hat Canada as Chief Strategist, Todd was instrumental in helping government agencies in British Columbia increase public value through the rapid creation of digital services using modern technologies and DevOps principles. So my understanding is you gentlemen have done some excellent work recently in BC as well, but I'll leave you to include that in your presentation. So gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. Cheers. Okay, so today we'd like to focus on earth-shattering insights, as everybody really wants to see those, and then take the context of today, which is, we need a resurgence. Obviously, we have vaccines coming, but in reality, we have budgets that are over-allocated. We have the requirements for shrinking some efforts, and we want to see the Canadian public sector have a resurgence. I'm Shlomo Bielak, CTO at Benchmark Corp. To you, Todd.
Hi there, Todd Wilson, Chief Strategist with Red Hat, and I agree 100% with Shlomo that what we've seen over the last 8-10 months with the response to COVID-19 is the public sector is at a pivot point. And I think it's a great opportunity at this pivot point, but there's a fork in the road and it could go either way. So what Shlomo and I want to see is we want to see it go down the right road. So that's what we're here to talk about today.
Next slide. Can we make it full? Can we add it as the central? Okay, I'll go small. So I wanted to touch on a few things here. Basically, we need to cover improve operating income. These are all the considerations of a downturn, right? So you need to improve your operating income. You need to retain and attract your talent pool. This is really difficult within Canada considering our talent constraints. And then also target growth, right? Or target customer experience, which is technically the growth within the public sector. So you have cost-cutting initiatives, you have budget constraints, you have potentially mandated reductions of spend. With refresh budgets, sometimes they're flat. In some respects, there are also reductions. So leaders have to find these efficiencies. And our earth-shattering insights that we're going to show you is how to do it with this mandate. You've already spent, or you've overspent, so why again, right? We're going to talk into that, and then obviously there's all the regulatory pieces. The retaining talent, that's extremely hard. The reason being is you have heavy burden on existing staff. The heavy burden on existing staff is because of anti-patterns that we're doing, and we'll talk about those. And it's very hard to attract top talent when you have a mandate to improve your operating income, right? Because in many respects, what's drawing them to you, right? So you also have target growth, you have cloud, you have containers, you have all of these aspects that are actually widening your technology sprawl and burden for the workforce. So these are not things that are really great to mandate. It's more very concerning to many organizations. So how do we achieve that? How do we do that with these requirements? Next slide. So we want to forget the industry's rearview mirror. I don't want to target tech. We need to focus on the data, and I'm going to share with you data and then share with you data that shows the truth. So the risks are very clear. Digital transformation globally is 70 to 75, depending on 2019 or 2020, are stalled or failed, right? These are projects that are heavily spent, overspent, don't go where they want. And the argument is it's vision. right? Many say it's vision. It's entirely not. It's not thought leadership. It's not vision. It's that we're not targeting the source of sustainable transformation, which is actually engineering talent constraints and the removal of toil. So if we create, and we're going to show you how to do that, if we create methods that remove toil, not reduce it, automation will reduce toil, orchestration removes toil, we'll get into that, and then remove heroics, we'll actually have time to do these digital transformation efforts. You can't do them if your talent is focused on what's burdening them today. We'll also show you a solution that incorporates cost-effective methods to protect the talent, meaning how do I operate? What do I use? How do I do it with a minimal budget, right? And then we'll define how that enablement occurs. The repeatability of process, not SOWs. This is a very, very big piece with respect to the public sector. I find, having provided services to the public sector, unless an RFP is written in a way that actually prevents the repeatability need of SOW itself, you don't get sustainability. You get, again, I need it again, come back, come back. This is not what we want to achieve. We want the applicability to say, if I use your systems, and it's mentioned by previous speakers, if I have a system, I need live code on it. The target isn't having a live system, it's having live code on it in any data center. Our own data centers or public cloud data centers, 2 of them, 4 of them, it's irrelevant. Next slide.
Actually, before we jump to the next one, Shlomo, I just want to reinforce something that I'm picking up on from you. So I agree 100% about the failures of digital transformation efforts because they're not focusing enough on the people that are actually delivering the services. And the way I frame that when I talk to people is, if we're wanting to, be participating in a digital transformation, re-envisioning how the organization is delivering to the customers, you need to make sure that the pipeline that's delivering those things is effective. And then how to get people's mind around that is I say, what if you treated your dev teams like customers? And what if their productivity was the currency that you're measuring on? And the platforms that they're using, those are your products. And if you start to shift your mindset a little bit on focusing on delivery, focusing on your teams, and focusing on the processes that they use and the tools that they have at hand, all of a sudden you start to realize that these digital transformations really aren't, it's not magical. It's not that hard to get your head around. It's all about making sure that your people are set up for success.
Agreed. So you're also coming back to the engineering talent. If we build it for the engineering talent needs, then you're going to see sustain and scale occur.
Exactly.
So there's a little cross off there, and we'll need to actually press again. Essentially, I'm suggesting that even if you don't have the budget, you still need to do it. And the reality is, I've heard from so many different places, this is one of the earth-shattering insights, stating that COVID has accelerated digital transformation. I'd love to see that, considering our spends are down across the board, globally as well in Canada. So like Canada has a little more drastic than the global average. But in reality, the spends are down, and if the spends are down, digital transformation, I'm still suggesting, can occur. It just won't be done in the traditional fashion, which is buy it. And I'm not a believer, and I know Todd's not a believer, you buy digital transformation. I know that's the norm in many respects, where we think buying tools will solve challenges. Buying tools fill some needs, but really what we need to focus on is, again, what we said, the developer experience, those that are consuming the platform, delivering value on these platforms. How do they get them to the customers? How do you make reliable and resilient systems?
Yeah, I think also it highlighted, you take a look at, because of the way, the pandemic has forced people to work from home, and you look at some more traditional organizations that were really struggling with the digital transformation, all of a sudden their entire workforce had to work remote. And typically, developers were treated like administrators, like privileged access resources. They were behind firewalls, they were in secure buildings, and they were locked away. And all of a sudden, they realized that that was a very expensive way to do business. Having, the devs using, all of these expensive connections, direct connections to servers, all of the network infrastructure that was necessary to support that was very expensive to maintain. Really, when your developers don't need that. And in fact, it actually impedes their productivity. So again, there's sort of this, develop low, deploy high kind of concept that people have been talking about. And use your low fidelity, low tech, and fast cycles on the development side, and you will save an immeasurable amount of money on infrastructure and dev environments and network firewalls and all of these things that are typically actually quite expensive to provision, quite time consuming to manage, and just another piece of equipment that is sort of a bit left over from a bygone era, when now we're talking about sort of the digital era and the cloud reality, is developers are far more productive when they're using the machine and they're using cloud services. So cheaper, better, faster.
I'll add to it. Having gone down this path, I kind of see that while cloud does remove some of these requirements, you can kind of build the same public cloud experience on premise by using some of the capabilities we'll talk about with toil as code and what toil as code is, meaning infrastructure and configuration. We'll get to it. I do believe that there are capabilities that you enhance for people who consume services in public cloud, but I'm also a very strong proponent for leveraging the assets you have and operating them exactly the same way as we'll go there. Next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna, not myself, Todd and I are gonna touch on what we consider to be the anti-patterns and the current state of IT, and this is gonna be really painful. You're going to find a lot of items here that you're going to relate to, and you should. I've been there myself before. This is a common practice within all IT-related organizations or development or software organizations. You have two types of requirements. One is day two, which is generally unplanned, right? Operate, we kind of got down, but when things break, we need to deal with it. And then on the other side is either unplanned or planned day one activities. I want to touch on very, very sensitive item here, which is when bad things happen and the team's working very hard on an item. They do triage or they have to hand over between a vendor or support teams. What essentially is happening is escalations that will impact other initiatives occur. It impacts life, right? For many people, you might not eat dinner when you want, you might have a delivery on the weekend that hurts quite badly, or you only do changes at 4 a.m. on Wednesday. I'm only bringing this up because we are accepting those heroics. We're accepting those staff constraints, and we'll explain how we can remove them. And then recognize that the same staff then has to actually do the digital transformation pieces. And how are they going to do that when they have the day one activities, either planned or unplanned, when you have an escalation? So let's walk through day one. Change is wanted. The resource, is he available or not? It might be on an escalation, it might be on a fire. The talented people are focused on bringing things back up. Again, you go back to handover because you can't see what's going on. And then all the incidents are interrupted so you can work on day one. And based on statistics and all the studies out there, if you interrupt someone's work, it impacts their motivation, it impacts their want to stay at an organization. It's actually extremely frustrating. And it's, again, you're impacting the talent pool. They're the same staff. So I've had many customers that say, how do we do this then? How do you do the digital transformation? Where do I start? I'm overburdened. I don't have the budget. So next slide.
Yeah, just let me throw in 2 cents, Shlomo, before we run. So I agree 100% that the anti-patterns there are pervasive and very familiar probably to everybody on this call. One of the ways I like to sort of unpack these things when I'm thinking about them is again, just to kind of tease out a bit of why. Why is it this way? Why is this so common? Why is this experience so ubiquitous? And what I've found when talking to people, it's because this is considered the best way to handle risk. There's risk and uncertainty with delivering these services. There's risk and uncertainty around breakages and outages. And so by having these processes in place, they feel that it's a good way to manage the risk. What they've missed, though, is the risk is actually a symptom of the problem in the first place. And so that process and that risk around it is actually creating more process and more risk around it. And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways that these very processes that get put in place to handle risk actually increase your risk in failing.
I have a very similar perspective. The only difference is I kind of find it's more of we haven't we haven't separated our value from the efforts that we do. Rather, we should be creating value, and the value itself is inherent. It's not related to how many hours I work. So there's a big confidence thing where you need to be comfortable in your role, produce the value even if it didn't take as long, and let processes do it for you. So it's separating ourselves from our efficacy in a role and what we do, and then making processes do it for us so we can work on something else. That's a huge leap for most people. And that's why I kind of find SOPs and MOPs still exist. So you still have your standard operating procedure, you still have your maintenance operating procedures. They're very laden with human elements, meaning people are just orchestrating, which kind of leads to the next slide, which is if you adopt open source, and I'm going to explain why you can. Did we switch slides back? Can we go to the next? I think we've skipped ahead.
There we go.
Thanks. So essentially what we're proposing here is if we handle the infrastructure creation and the configuration of set infrastructure or applications, it's not respective to just infrastructure, we can turn these SOPs and MOPs into actual things that can be consumed and repeated. Whatever context it is, it's an independent pipeline or it's a pipeline that delivers software, put them in there and join them so you can have a singular function. The point is the removing of the toil. So we call it toil as code. Remove the things you do to make infrastructure, remove the things that you do to configure it, so you can actually start stepping away from day 2 or day 1 challenges so you can start improvements. Here, the most important piece that I always bring up, and then Todd, it's over to you, is it's more about understanding that you don't need enterprise support for everything. So do you have enterprise support for a SOP? Do you have enterprise support for a MOP? Do we have enterprise support for any of the handcrafted things that we do? The answer is no. So my suggestion here is create a consistent outcome for infrastructure and configuration, which is a very large burden on organizations today when you're adopting complex infrastructure, multi-cloud. Think of it, if I build the process to build it, 1 cloud, 2 cloud, 3 cloud, I'm not burdening my team anymore. I'm just updating the components that build it for me. So getting technology to work for you rather than you working for technology. That's what we're targeting open source. I'm not saying put platforms as open source. You could start that way, and then when you have budget, move towards paid versions. But I actually think you should never have a paid version for infrastructure as code or config as code in many respects. You can if you need to do some very, very rigorous requirements. But start with open source, because in reality you have a risk right now, and it's burdening those that talent pool that's actually pushing that forward.
Yep, I agree that there is a lot of broken support models, especially with large software vendors that will remain nameless. One of the things that I think is critical, especially in the public sector, and Shlomo, you picked up on it, starting with open source tools and starting in the open, and also adapting those ways of working, right? Working in a collaborative way, sharing your scripts, having things be, have multiple eyes on them, and working in the open is critical. And then once you get into that mode and once you're working in this way, your barriers to entry are very low on a whole entire stack of tools that you can start working with very quickly and start leveraging very quickly. And then once you see what's working, and then also once you see what skill sets you have in your shop, ones you're missing, where you would need some extra help, that's where an enterprise support model starts to come in, and it starts to be a value proposition at that point, right? You could start to say, hey, if we had, support on releases and updates of that component of our stack, that would take a whole bunch of toil off of my team, and it would be something that we would leverage, and that's worth paying for. That's worth investing in. And so it's an investment conversation as opposed to a procurement conversation, and making sure that those investments that you're making in software are freeing up money so that you can invest more in your team and more in your people.
Or freeing up the team so that people can do other things, which is really your starting point. So I do make one suggestion before we go into other areas. I've had discussions on this point before, so where do you start when things are actually in a shape, which is generally the case? Surprisingly, it's your mental health. Go for a walk. If you're going to take on digital transformation, you're going to learn at the start that going for a walk is going to keep you stable while you take on additional hurdles to actually release the toil that's there. Because there'll be extra work, there'll be extra challenges, there'll be extra pushes that you need to help your team with. So I just put that as a side note for most organizations. Don't forget your mental health. Don't forget to get yourself outside because your body needs to sustain you through that transformation. I'll move to two other pieces, which is very, very key. You need to be able to change how day two operates. Day two is going to require some SLIs. What I mean by that is like service level indicators to tell you if things are going well or not. And based on those, engage resources proactively if something goes wrong. This is not a large or difficult task. It's more of how do you do it, what are the options. We'll actually show you some open source options out there so that when an issue occurs, and it is distinguished, meaning it is a type of an incident. It knows who to go to and who to engage so that you don't have to watch dashboards. You don't have to have a center of excellence for application operations. You just need observability and metrics, which is probably in some of the previous chats and talks, where you are engaging resources so that they can focus on the innovation requirements and removal of toil rather than focus on alerts and validating that alerts need to be actioned and who needs to action them. The other piece of it is day one, which is very, very important, is there's two types of methods. One is a ITSM business process, which also includes sometimes RPA. That's more about completing, onboarding, offboarding, managing assets, things like that. But then there's also the commit code pipeline, which is if someone who wants to consume or deliver services into our cloud, on-premise, public cloud, or multi-cloud, they can commit code and that's all they do, right? From there, the pipeline does the rest of the work for them. Again, removal of toil, right? Removal of heroics. I don't need to be the one that's the only guy who can do this job. It needs to be the process is the only thing that can do it, and I shouldn't need access. So you will also need to create orchestration artifacts. What I mean by that is that's automation. When people say I've done wicked automation, that's great. Until you orchestrate it, all you've done is reduce your toil, not remove it. Todd?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I really do want to pick up on sort of that division between day one and day two. And I agree 100% that changing your perception of day two is critical. One of the things that I've always harped on is if you can blur that line between dev, day one, day two, low level ops, sysadmin level ops, the more blurry you can make that line, the more you're on the right track. And I think there is a whole bunch of shared learning, collaboration in those spaces. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't specialist roles and specialist skills that are necessary at those very levels, but if those folks are in silos, they don't have open communication channels between teams, they aren't able to access knowledge at varying levels of the stack, they aren't able to access folks at varying levels of the life cycle, then you're already setting yourself up for failure. Those teams need to have ready access to the right people at the right time and a single, point of communication, a single communication channel for folks to be able to chime in. Because that way you've successfully started to blur the line so that if a problem happens, you have more eyes on it than just the day two people. You have folks across the entire life cycle of that application who have knowledge of the entire application at varying levels, and you can get to the root of things pretty quickly in a collaborative way. So the handoffs of tickets and sort of that, team A takes it first and they escalate to team B and then team B escalates to team C. That's where a lot of the friction is inherent in the system. And if you can eliminate that handoff friction and have people work in a more collaborative, more sort of product focused way, you're going to end up ahead. So, whether that's looking at your roles, thinking about, the site reliability engineer role, how that would fit into your team, figuring out how ops automation and some of the robotic automation that we're talking about, how do those fit in? Who's responsible for those scripts? Who updates them? How do we talk about them when they're broken? And those are the things that I think are critical to setting yourself up for being able to be responsive, but also be able to move quickly.
Agreed. I've seen it in many organizations where until you've profiled things that you haven't seen or things that you have seen, it's very difficult for the team to change mode of operation. So very important to profile and categorize incidences so that you can reduce triage. And every time something comes through, it's not so much about the post-mortem report, or our RCA report. It's more about, did I quantify that risk? Did I categorize that risk? So the next time it occurs, rather than blame, when it happens again, it goes to the right person. It goes to the right team to work on it, right? Things break, right? Or things self-heal, hopefully, as you progress. But in reality, you need to categorize those so you have a proactive model. Next slide. Okay, so let's kind of walk through what each of these are, and then we'll actually show the model that we're suggesting to actually do this. So look, the gaps that we have currently in Canada, it doesn't matter which sector you are, is there are doer gaps. So that is why we partnered up with Red Hat. Red Hat has a very advanced stack with regards to digital transformation, container platforms, automation, resiliency. So we're on the do side. I just wanted to share that. So for organizations that are trying to do this, I generally find you'll need to do a model, and we'll show you what that is. But at the same time, we need to build out a training model that creates doers, not thought leaders. I kind of fall into the category of both, because I think thought leadership's needed so they know to create the doers. But the reality is, if we create a training model where if you take a person through this process, either the day one or the day two, are they able to take someone else through it? So we call it inner source training. It's not very common today, but it needs to be used more, which is a process and a completed RFP is only successful, not from the business success criteria, but from the change agent criteria, i.e. the systems we put in place, the person or teams and stakeholders we took through this are able then to take other customers or other stakeholders through it, and then they are successful. So you get a growing body for sustaining and scaling, because your challenge isn't the technology, it is process, because obviously the talent pool is having anti-patterns, but you need to have a training process that's focused on the success of those that are trained to become the trainer. That's key. And then on the efficient patterns of IT, let's say you've built them. Let's just walk through them. For day two, let's say I set service levels. Most organizations, if they ask me, where do you start when I don't have good, efficient patterns of IT? Set the service levels. Measure yourself, right? It's not so much the observability, it's more of, does the business have service levels that they consider to be representative of a good experience? Then build out the observability capabilities. It could be user experience, it could be application performance, infrastructure monitoring, network performance, whatever you want it to be. They become your observability metrics. When I say dashboard, it's not to look at them, they're just there if you need to present. And then if something happens, no one's marking it. It identifies the service level that's breached based on the profile that you've chosen for it. We talked about profiling incidences. Assign it to the SME that actually needs to work on this. There should not be handover, triage. It should be, this service level is impacted by this service. This person's the SME for this service. Go and work on it. And then track your service levels, right? And then make sure that you reward people not for their heroics. If you reward someone for fixing it by hand, you've done this wrong. If you reward them for fixing it so other people can benefit from it, reward the repeatability, the repeatability value of the fix, so that ticket gets resolved and you don't see it again, right? Comments, Todd?
Yeah, for sure. And, I couldn't agree more. And a lot of the things I think that you're talking about, when I take a step back and bring it up a level, right, a lot of these things are sort of inherent components of working in an open source community, right? So making sure that it's clear on how you contribute, making sure it's clear on the process of how things get changed, how things get brought in, how things get evaluated, how the value of a particular fixed feature or enhancement gets described. And then also making sure that that is a repeatable exercise for any of the organization to pick it up and do it again. So what ends up happening, I find, when you adopt these principles, and also, the metrics that you're talking about, Shlomo, are key, right? Making sure that you're measuring things and making sure that you're moving those numbers in the right direction, right? Are we continually improving this? Are we doing it better? And if there is friction, why is there friction? Start to, talk about it. It isn't just necessarily because that SME doesn't know what they're doing. That SME might be, a victim of some other problem that is happening in the organization. So then making sure that you're looking at things holistically and not just from a technology point of view. Because one of the things that's surprising is if you come up with really poor metrics, you're going to come up with really poor output. And I've been in organizations where we had SLAs that were very, aggressive, but not well aligned to the business. So even though we were working really hard to hit these numbers, that wasn't seen as valuable on the business delivery side of the can. And so making sure that whatever you're measuring, whatever outcomes you're measuring, what KPIs you're using, and what outcomes you're driving towards, making sure that those are tightly connected to business value is critical.
So I'll touch on that before we go to the next one, which is day one. I would say there's two pieces that you need to highlight there. Having been a CISO previously in the US, I found that state is irrelevant. Deltas are the key. So you're tracking progress. Don't care so much about where you are today, because when you measure it, it's not going to look good. And looking good is, look, we want to, but in reality, that's not the indicator you want. You want the delta. So if you, over 5 months, improve 4%, fantastic. If you degrade, that delta is risk. Why are you degrading, right? If you're degrading from where you were, that's something to catch up on. And then if you are improving, that's what you need to promote and find out what they're doing so others do it. So I'd say delta, and then I'll also touch a unique perspective. Velocity, in respect to public sector, in many areas where velocity isn't always a customer requirement, chosen velocity should be your outcome. I want to be able to choose the speed that I go at based on the business or customer's ask. So today, the customer may ask every month, and if I do a month, that's fine, because that's what the customer wants. So I'm able to meet the customer requirements. If they ask in a month from now to go a week faster, do I have the abilities to go faster? So it's chosen velocity, managing the deltas that you have. They're very, very key, rather than what's the state and how fast can I go. Neither of those are KPIs you should be tracking. It's more of where are you going. Day one, I think the greatest risk to the public sector is ad hoc requests. The reason being is that process then doesn't become part of self-service, and that process then doesn't become part of a code commit. So any organization that I go into and they say they have very poor ITSM intake processes, it is the catalyst to prevent change. The reason being is that you can't track when it came in, you get no KPIs, you don't know what's breaking or what they're asking for, it's not structured. So I do put requests up here, not to promote that people put in requests, but to make sure your intake pipeline is structured, and then offer two methods. Self-service, right, i.e. catalog potentially, for things that make sense for catalog, and then also code commit, which is, I also need to provide services that are software-based that get created and delivered. I need a pipeline that does that. I'm a proponent for orchestration. I do believe that automation is important, but I actually find automation based on implementation. It was the catalyst for us. It prevented us from advancing where we want to. We had an epic failure in digital transformation because we focused on tools that automated rather than orchestrating those tools. So what happened was we had people working on the automation and running the automation rather than running orchestration that runs the automation for us. So our team was then managing and maintaining automation rather than improving the orchestration itself. Don't forget security as you do this. I do highlight that. Security, infrastructure, and app. And then build those delivery pipelines, build those ITSM pipelines, so you can get to the same result, which is you get auto-resolve tickets. Right? I released, great. It should be a non-event, right? A released application should be a non-event. A request should be a non-event. A self-service should be a non-event. Improvements, raising your delta, that is an event that you should focus on.
Yeah, and I would agree with your orchestration observation. I think one of the things that in my past that we didn't use the word orchestration when we were talking about things like that, but we were always talking about making sure that the platform was purpose built and fit for purpose. And so we were always adding to the platform to avoid repetitive tasks or things that were very complex. And so if we were able to use a platform approach to abstract away complexity and abstract away toil, and I think that's sort of what you're getting towards with orchestration as well, is like using an abstraction layer so that we're not focusing too tightly on the weeds. Then we're also making sure that, not everybody needs to know exactly how all of those things work. They just need to know how to use them. And if they can use them and use them effectively, these tools will work great for them. So, using abstraction, using platform approaches to pipelines, to processes and things like that is key to having that, both that day one and that day two story be as efficient as possible.
Next slide. Okay, so this one's the most important one, which is the context. I've had so many discussions with clients, public sector, private. I always respond to them in saying VMware is entirely enough to create a public cloud customer experience. You need to add some things to it, right? Because it's not natively going to cover all aspects of a modern technology stack. So we put some components here that make up what I consider to be essentially DevOps enablement, delivery enablement. This is not only a platform, this will be day one, day two experience. And we put some open source capabilities here too. So those that want to achieve this when they don't have budget can work on a journey. And when that budget opens up, they can buy the support that they need. They can implement additional bells and whistles that you require, but you have a starting point. And the starting point basically says, I either have a posture within the cloud, choose what it is. From my perspective, it doesn't really matter. It could be public, it could be private, it could be containerized, it may not be containerized, it could be hybrid, multi, your choice. The unleashing components for this to create day one and day two, and you'll see the arrows that draw down into the automation pipeline, which is actually an orchestrator. You need 4 components to remove toil. Infrastructure as code. Again, this is everything as code. Config as code, and that's by the way, everything as code is a Todd addition, which I agree with. Config as code, again, you need this so that you don't handcraft. Infrastructure, so that you don't have to spend time building it. Again, this is on-premise. Or public. Yeah, I'm not distinguishing between them because the public cloud was built for a use case. On-premise, unless you fix your on-premise capabilities and you try to go cloud without these processes in place, it's a disaster. I've been through it. You can't just do greenfield capabilities in public cloud. The reason being is unless you fix your house in itself, right? Your house is in order. You're going to build bad practices in an area that's going to burn you more, and you're going to blow out your budgets. The reason being is somewhere that charges you the more mistakes you make is not a great place to practice, right? So my thought here is build out your on-premise capabilities, processes, using these 4 components, and then adopt public cloud once you've actually solved it for private cloud. Private cloud, in my world, is just another data center that can become part of the customer experience that public cloud provides. It's just, we haven't built out those capabilities. We're kind of looking at the green field and go, okay, go down that way. That was a little soapbox from my side. Then you have measurement. Again, measurement isn't infrastructure only. It's now synthetic testing. It's now application performance. It's transactional. It's chaos load, right? So when I say measurements, it's more of when I create chaos, do I know when things are breaking so that when I put it into production, it doesn't happen. I heard some comments in earlier talks that were about when bad things happen in prod, but in reality, I've run without incident for multiple months. The reason being is we just destroyed the previous environments. We put 10x loads randomly as scheduled jobs into lower level environments, and then prod looked like a cakewalk. You know what I mean? It's just enjoy. Like it's nowhere near what the other systems have seen or gone through. So you have stability. You have stability by producing instability in the lower levels. and measuring them. The key is measuring them. Putting in stability without measurement and doing these components, you would just add environments that would require rebuild. You need to be able to rebuild with ease. And then change in incident management. And then I put like open duty there where you can actually do what PagerDuty does similarly at a starting point. It doesn't have all the capabilities, but it's enough to get started from a proactive model. The most important piece is the stuff that connect to the automation pipeline. The automation pipeline is key. Look, training training is obviously key. Documentation is key, but the orchestration layer is the goal that you can reproduce and give to someone else. I.e., the faster you get someone towards their goal, the faster you can give that to someone else because it's entirely code. Look what they did. Okay, adopt it. It's not a piece of automation, it's the entire end-to-end process that they can adopt. We have a unique pipeline governor, which we call security fitness. I kind of find when you start doing this, and I know public sector's earlier stages, when you do 1,000 of these, let's say you make 1,000 pipelines, the first 100 is not going to be as good as the last 100, right? So you need to set a way to baseline measure all of the automation, which is static, technically, unless you put a fitness capability above it that says the last 100 are 4 times better than the first 100. Here's the components you're missing, so that you can then move the last 100 to the newest 100. So this is like a sum of all delivery model.
Yeah, and the thing I'd sort of want to highlight here from my perspective, and again, just sort of reiterate, some of the points from earlier where, we're reducing toil, we're increasing everything as code, and also an abstraction layer. And so this is where, in my experience, OpenShift was a critical component in this stack. So it was able to be, a developer-focused Kubernetes cluster that had all of the necessary components for developers to be able to build and deploy quickly and have their work be production ready, compliant, and ready to go without necessarily having to be an expert on all of those lower level tasks. Because one of the things I think is, gets a little bit swept under the rug is that not all dev teams are created equal, and many of them are mere mortals. And there is a lot of moving parts involved, with Terraform, Ansible, VMware. All of these components are quite complex and require a fair amount of expertise. If they're working under the covers, under a platform like OpenShift, you can successfully abstract away a lot of that complexity and a lot of that operational complexity so that the dev teams can focus on what they should be focusing on, delivering features for their app. That's really what you want them to focus on.
Agreed. So I think building out a robust operational model, OpenShift's capabilities, and if you focus on really what people want rather than just throwing everything to the devs. I kind of find the world is shifting towards devs do everything. They don't want to. They don't want to be the DevOps guys. They don't want to be the security guys. Shift left security. They don't want it. The reality is we need to build a process and operating model that incorporates those business requirements, governance requirements, and then let them just commit. And then the technology should be capable of saying, these are the things we want to test. This is how we promote. It should orchestrate it for them and include all those requirements. That model that we just presented is really the underpinning for creating that SRE operating model for an organization so that when a developer comes and says, look, I'm not really good at this, they can go to the onboarding process documentation and from there build the changes that they need so they can release code on the platform that's ready for them. Do they need to do all this testing? It'll say you might need a test Docker image. Okay, fantastic. Here it is. Put it over here. The system will pull it and use it. So while they're bringing artifacts in, they're not actually the ones owning. They're more fulfilling the process's requirements so that they can deliver consistently and reliably into whatever system they're doing. I had the same experience with OpenShift. It was our starting point for modern technologies, immutable infrastructure. Things that don't need to be fixed are destroyed. That mindset where things don't live forever, that was the biggest change for us, where OpenShift was our starting point, where we said, okay, what happens when a container, we actually added it to an interview question. What happens when you have something like a container and has errors? And they start telling me, oh, well, look at the logs. I said, stop, destroy it. Figure out what's wrong with the release, make a new one. destroy it. A new one will come up in what, 3 to 5 seconds? Who cares, right? You don't need it up. The other ones are serving. So hopefully with that, next slide, hopefully with that, we've covered a lot of items that you can use regardless of what, oh, press space again, that I thought was there. That you thought you can use when the budget's not there. Go for a walk to keep yourself stable during an extra lift to take away the toil. You can't take away toil unless you take on more toil at first, and then at some point the walks are less needed, but focus on helping your talent pool do what they need to. Open source is a great starting point to advance. Both Todd and I have had those experiences where we've had great success with multiple teams adopting modern technologies on-premise and cloud with governance. And it just comes down to focus on fixing the model, focus on fixing the process. Don't focus just on buying things. The reason being is you're going to be working for them and they're not going to be working for you.
Absolutely. And ditto. And thanks, Shlomo, for letting me have the opportunity to join you here today. And I hope we have a little time for questions. So let's maybe see what's happening out there in the chat channel.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here, gentlemen, and then Emily, I'll get you to chime in too with some questions in addition. So one question we got had to do with like the HR changes within the public sector. As you gentlemen know, often you see like a shifting of resources and whatnot in departments and ministries. And the question is like, could you walk through, and you kind of talked about it a little bit, but like how this approach would avoid any challenges or any issues of like HR changes. So when you're in the middle of a project and then suddenly the project lead or some key people leave, you know, how does your methodology or whatnot kind of address that particular challenge the public sector often faces?
For sure, right? Losing folks through attrition or because they're contractors and their contract has expired, or there's all a varying amount of reasons why that can happen. One of the things that we've seen be very successful is if you have codified your onboarding process and your documentation and everything as code, you're well set up for reducing that onboarding curve, and just accept the fact that people are going to move on and accept the fact that change is the norm. And so one of the things that's available in OpenShift now is a tool called Code Ready Workspaces, which is basically a developer environment in a container. So if you have a new developer show up and they need their environment set up, they need all of the varying bips, bobs, widgets, tools, and workflows, it's actually living in a container, and they can access that through a web browser. They don't need to download anything. They don't need to install anything. They can just go to an IDE that's running in a container in the cluster. And so that is a massive accelerator to start addressing some of that churn. And if these containers are fairly standardized and fairly regularized across your organization, as people move from team to team, these are things that become much less invasive. Shlomo, any thoughts there?
I say it's the thing we hate doing most. It's the documentation, and the documentation in a method or medium that wants to be consumed by the stakeholders. So devs want READMEs in Git. Operations generally will want SharePoint or Confluence. Again, so if you build out the documentation, and that documentation is actually not a static page that's not being updated regularly, I kind of find when people go, it happens, we all have it. What I kind of find is if you're operating in a day one, day two mode where you still have talent heroics, when that talent hero goes, two things will happen. One, you'll be burned really badly. And then two, you'll stop using heroes. Because the moment a hero leaves, the organization goes into shock because they can't deliver. And then at that point they go, this is really bad. Why are we in this circumstance? We love that person. But we just recognize all their, self-efficacy based on heroism actually undermined our project. Both can happen. What I'm suggesting is some organizations are laden with talent heroics, and when they leave, as you're suggesting, you will go through shock and bad things will happen. And then process will be built out, the onboarding process, the operating model. Those are the two pieces. As long as they're well documented and followed by all members, how do I run this environment? How do I bring people through? When you lose one person, it doesn't become irrelevant, but it becomes a non-event. But if you're hero laden right now and a hero leaves, you will be burned significantly. And you will learn from there that the process, the documentation that we hate so much to do, meaning it's a last minute thing, should have actually been part of the RFP. Or it should have been part of the stage one, which is what should it look like for who and who's building it and responsible. We kind of always add it after the fact, and it's the most important part for resilience.
Okay, thank you very much. What else we got here? I think, oh yeah, there's another question. So this one has to do with, you were talking about like the importance of like consolidation before moving to the public cloud or whatnot. And I think they're looking for a little bit more flavor, a little bit more details around like, you know, your experience in watching people do that, like make those mistakes. Because I think from a government of Canada and the provincial perspective, like they're on the cups of cloud, so they're making these very important decisions now. So like, you know, what should organizations keep in mind during the consolidation process, or you know, before they move to the public cloud, to avoid those like costly mistakes? So maybe you could walk us through a bit of a case study, maybe, without mentioning any specific.
I won't mention one RFPs, but to be honest, I've bid on those RFPs and won. So context. I am one of few that believe that on-premise can operate as a public cloud experience. But it is extremely important. The reason being is those assets are a static spend for you. And to be honest, our budgets, when they go over, we don't recover very well, to be honest. No one's going to give you another chance once you've blown a budget. It's kind of like, why did we do that? End that project. It was a waste. And it's not that. It's just sometimes we make decisions where, let's say we go public cloud, but we don't have the process, we don't have the operating model, we don't have the documentation. And then we're hoping that we're going to figure it out somewhere else. That from a finance perspective, from a CFO perspective, it's dangerous unless you're ready for it. So open source, good starting point. Todd's done the same thing. Do it within your data centers. And when you talk about consolidation, I do believe consolidation on a common platform is great. The reason being is you're minimizing or normalizing all the technologies you're using so that you can put them into an operating model. You can have an onboarding process. It's quite hard to do that when you have 50 different technologies, right? Because each one's going to need a different onboarding process, a different operating model. So consolidate into common platforms, but you can do on-premise capabilities exactly the same as public cloud. You can even do, nowadays, even OEM vendors allow you to do what do you call it? Expandable capacity. So now you don't have lead time for gear. So they're there, we're not. Our organization really focuses on this, where you've spent billions of dollars across Canada on data center assets. Those assets can operate just like cloud. It's not as if cloud's just going to be this magic silver line. The case studies, take them with a grain of salt. Everybody wants to present a strong case. You don't know their talent pool. You don't know their spend. You don't know what was actually successful if those KPIs were supposed to be presented the way they were. And then you take the risk by reading a case study. But you're unique. So build it where it's safe. Build it where you have it. Consolidate, because I actually find consolidation is very good from a management overhead or technical sprawl for talent. And then look at public cloud as something to unleash your process and onboarding, your operating model, or an extension of what you've already achieved. But do not take the plunge directly greenfield to cloud. It is very dangerous. Lift and shift also, even with tweaks, is extremely dangerous because you don't have the resilience. You can't manage the chaos. And it's not within the realm of your governance. So it's a challenge.
Amen and hallelujah. I actually agree 100% with Shlomo on all of that. At the risk of being like, a cloud denier, what we did in BC, and I'll really use our own history as the use case, is, 5 years ago, we had our data center consolidated. To Shlomo's point, billions of dollars was spent doing that effort. And it was a good move, right? It was the right move. What happened is it got very difficult to interface with it. Teams had a hard time onboarding. Access to resources was very difficult. These weren't problems with the data center itself. These were problems with the process around the data center. And by alleviating that friction, we were able to create a platform. We used OpenShift as our cloud platform for the on-prem data center. We were able to create an experience for the developers in BC that they stopped talking about public cloud because we removed the barriers to the resources. They were able to get at what they needed. They were able to deploy their applications. They were able to go to production, and they were able to do it using modern tools, open source technology, and modern methods. What that now has led to 5 years later, now BC is looking at public cloud, but they're looking at it very differently. They're not talking about a wholesale lift and shift. They're not talking about just push everything into VMs in the cloud. They're taking a look at, we've actually got a pretty decent cloud native footprint in our own data center. How are we going to augment our apps with services from the cloud? So they're looking at things that are very, interesting, but stuff you wouldn't necessarily build on-prem, like, IoT frameworks or, giant, big data processing, things like this that make sense to use the hyperscale of the public cloud, where you just wouldn't build that at home.
Agreed.
And so having that capability to say, where do we want to deploy this app? Because where does it make sense for it to leverage the services that it needs? And then having a common platform for that deployment. And so, using, containers, using Kubernetes, and in BC's case, it was OpenShift in Azure and OpenShift on-prem that allowed them to kind of start to live that dream of being able to pick and choose where they wanted to deploy things to where it made sense and where it was cost effective. And so the analogy I use for people who are non-techie, right? It's like, okay, when you're buying cars, you have choices, right? You can buy the car outright. You can lease a car, you can rent a car, you can take a taxi, and all of them will get you places. And it's the same way when you're talking about servers, right? Are you going to buy the servers? Are you going to lease the servers? Are you going to, just rent them once in a while? Or are you just going to use them like public cloud? And I analogy for public cloud is they're the taxis, right? Are they the quick purpose-built things that you need for a very particular case? And there's cases that are great, but it doesn't necessarily mean you pump everything into the taxi.
I just don't distinguish between public and private. I think we have that mistake where you can't do it, but I kind of follow them all. Everybody says crawl, walk, run. Why do we presume that when we're laying down, which is in many respects the state that many are in, we're not crawling, that we can just run in the cloud? And I'm like, greenfield running in the cloud when you're laying down in your own data center isn't what we need to do. We need to be running in our own data center, operate the same way as the cloud, and then if we want, for use cases, adopt it where it makes sense. As Todd was saying, look, there's a lot. I'm not against public cloud. I use public cloud for all our services today, and there's reasons for it, and we do multi-cloud. Fantastic. But our operating model and onboarding process is extremely advanced, i.e. we're not impacted by picking another cloud. So I would ask one question, and if you can answer this question, yes, then do whatever you want. If someone tells you to switch public cloud providers and you say, yeah, that's easy, then you're ready for public cloud.
Absolutely.
Okay, I've got one more question, Jens, and we're right at the end here, so it's going to be a bit rapid fire. So you kind of talked a little bit about it a lot about it in your presentation, but what's the first steps towards helping a client that is trying to accelerate their digital transformation on a restricted or mostly deployed budget?
I'll start it. We talked about the open source, target the toil. And again, everybody says, I need enterprise support. It's production. I told you that Johnny that does it at 4 a.m. on Wednesday doesn't have enterprise support. He's doing it by hand, and he's guessing what he needs to do based on experience. Build it in code. Use open source capabilities to start. Build out the process. It's going to cost you nothing more than fixing what's wrong with the system, what's wrong with the anti-patterns of IT today. And look, go for a walk if he's taking a little extra time to get things going, right? That's what I was saying. It's always come back to go for a walk, because at the beginning, you're going to have to do a little extra work. No one wants to do the extra work, but you need to do the extra work to codify those changes so someone else can repeat that process rather than relying on Johnny at 3 a.m. So that's my take.
Yeah, I would add to that too. When taking a look at sort of the holistic view of a digital transformation, there's a lot of things that you can change for little or no dollars that make the biggest impact. For example, what's causing friction inside your organization are often, processes that are sort of old and antiquated and out of date. those processes don't cost any money to change. They may take a little time and a little horsepower and some analysis to figure out exactly where you should go. But, if you're looking in the public sector, you don't have to look far, right? There's procurement processes, audit processes, STRAs, PIAs, all sorts of things that are just ripe for process improvement. And they're free to improve because you own those processes. You don't actually buy them, and you can turn them into fit for purpose processes that are geared to accelerate the delivery of your teams.
I can only imagine what happens when you get a laptop delivered. You know what I mean? You get your laptop and you're like, now what? Well, it's just a box. So what do I do, right? That needs to be solved. I tell you right now, I don't know how many times I've worked at places, your laptop arrives in the mail and there's nothing. Like, how do I even log into it?
Okay, well, we're right at the hour here, gentlemen. But thank you very much. That was a very interesting perspective on cloud. That it was quite welcome, actually. I'm sure to the public sector who are deliberating their options here. But I'm sure the VMware folks and then Dean Hashi at ThinkOn would agree with you that the best cloud you have might be the one you already own, kind of thing. So appreciate you folks, Red Hat Benchmark, for sponsoring the event. Shlomo and Todd, great to have you. Hope to have you back next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin.
Kevin.